And he said to the sea, "Peace, be still," and the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And so he says to the disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And then at verse 41, it says, "And they, the disciples, were filled with great fear. And they said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" You know, as we read through this, it's easy to miss the main point. Because the main point of this is not Jesus getting you through the storms in your life. It's a point, but it's not the main point. The usual thing that most people walk away from as they read through this or they study this is Jesus calmed the storm on the lake. And so that means that he can calm the storm in your life. So Jeremy, just say that and then we can go home. But there's more here than that. Even though these lessons are true, it's not the main point of this passage. Another common point is that Jesus is with you in your trials, even though it may not seem like it, or even though you may forget it. He's there. And yes, that's true. Jesus is with you when the storms come, but that's not the main point. And you know, the Bible has lots of principles and biblical principles, and it may even speak directly to a circumstance that we are going through in the moment. And they are these things that can help us, these biblical truths, these timeless truths from the Bible that can help us through our storm. But you know, it can be dangerous to read ourselves into every verse in the Bible. It's dangerous because it can turn my emphasis of reading the Bible into more about me than it is about God. It becomes more about me than it is about Him. It's dangerous to read myself into every situation because then I begin to only search for things that I can relate to. My reading, my studying, my time with God becomes more about me than anything else. And we begin to focus on what is only beneficial for me in this time in my life. And the rest of it, well, I can live with it, or I can live without it. You see, and the main focus of this passage, it really isn't about us. It isn't about the storm. It isn't even about the disciples. And yes, there are principles that we can and that we should apply from this. And we shouldn't overlook those things. But there's more here than just that. Because the main point is this. So just so you know, I'm not going to give you the answers to the end. So I see some of you ready. So I'm building up to that. So you're going to have to wait. But the main point is essentially this. This event is the greatest revelation of who Jesus Christ is that the disciples had ever seen to date. The main point of this story answers the rhetorical question that the disciples ask at the end of this chapter. Who is this guy that the wind and the waves obey? And the focus isn't on what Jesus did, but on who He is. Mark, as he records this, it's not just another example of Jesus' power. It's a revelation of Jesus' identity. Because only God commands nature. And Jesus just did it. The passage, it begins with Jesus finishing this busy day of teaching. And essentially, there's one more lesson. He's going to give it to His disciples. He's going to give it to his inner followers. He says to the disciples, let us cross over to the other side. This is the words that He gave. And it's not a long trip. These guys were fishermen. Many of them were. And they probably made this trip several times. It was only about 5 miles from where they currently were. And Jesus, we know that He fell asleep. He was exhausted. He was probably tired from the demands of the people from that day. And did Jesus know the storm was coming? Probably. Definitely. However, one commentator said the Lord's sleep was not only because He was tired, but it was also a rest of faith. You see, Jesus, in one of the parables that He had talked about that day, was how the farmer works all day. He goes out and he seeds and he's doing all these things. But when he goes home, he's able to rest. So Jesus here, he's beginning to connect the things that He said, and He's modeling for the disciples that you can live this way. And Mark, he points out that there's other boats that were with them. Have you ever wondered who was in the other boats? I don't think it was the crowds. because these boats, it says that they were with Jesus too in verse 36. These boats, as you know, were in this storm as well. But who were in the boats? Well, remember in Mark chapter 4, verse 10, when there was more than just the 12 who were following Jesus? Verse 10 says, and when he was alone, he's talking about the parables, right? Those around him with the 12, they asked about the parables. So as Jesus is explaining the parables, he's explaining it to more than just the 12 disciples. There are more that are following him. The 12 are the inner crew. So Jesus had the 12 with him on his boat, and then the other disciples who were on the inside, those who were following closely, those who wanted to understand who Jesus was, they were following Jesus too. They were the ones who were in these other boats. And we'll talk about them in just a minute. So Jesus says to all of his disciples, hey, we're in the boat. Let's not go to shore. Let's not get any supplies. It's just 5 miles away. Let's just go to the other side. I'm wiped out. I'm tired. I need a break. Guys, let's just go now. Like I said, Jesus knew that the storm was coming. And we see that he was never surprised by the storm in this at all. He was only surprised by the reaction of his disciples. And the thing is, and maybe you understand this, that God has a habit of leading his people directly into storms. Right? That's something that we understand. And we find ourselves in these experiences that cause us to question if we have ever had any faith at all. Things are so bad that our faith falters. And have you ever wondered why the disciples were in the storm? It's because they were obedient. Jesus says, let's go over to the other side. I'm wiped out. I'm tired. I'm going to be sleeping down here. You guys take it from here. And they're like, okay, we've done this 1,000 times. We've got this, no problem. And they found themselves in this storm because they were immediately obedient to the words of Jesus Christ. And I'm not even going to try to impress you with my knowledge of the geography and the topography of the lake, because it's pretty unique in where it sits at sea level and with the mountains and in the area. All I'm going to say is that the Sea of Galilee and its region is well known, even now, for its sudden, violent, and deadly storms. The way that it is seated is just right, that these storms are whipped up in a hurry. It can be calm to chaos in moments. And that's what happens here. The boat is in danger. Jesus is wiped out and he's sleeping. And the disciples are working in the storm. And you know what they find out? All that they know and all that they experience and all of the knowledge that they bring is not good enough. It's falling short. And even though they never really had control, the idea of it was stripped away from them. And I think that we can relate to that. And so they wake Jesus up. And I don't think it was just one person who was nominated by the group and say, go get Jesus. And this guy goes down and says, hey, Jesus, hey, listen, there's a storm out there. Listen, the other guys are really nervous. Me, I'm cool. I'm good. But if you could just go reassure those guys, let them know that everything's going to be fine. That's not what happened. I think they went down as a group, right? And it was a mess. And whatever picture you have in your mind of this storm is probably worse than what you can imagine. It's not a storybook storm. This is more than probably a painting that you've seen. You know, this was something where these experienced sailors are chilled to the bone, and they believe with everything that's in them, we are going to die. This is it. And they're upset. And they're probably a little bit humbled because these sailors have to go to a carpenter to help save the boat. And so there's this huge storm, and the disciples, they did everything that they could do. But their plan would only save their boat if it worked. Their plan was, we need to save our boat. Even if they are successful in saving their boat and keeping them alive, there's other boats that are with Jesus that are in the same storm, and there's nothing that the disciples can do for them. They're not even trying. They're not even thinking about it. So when Mark says that Jesus calmed the storm, Jesus didn't just calm the storm for that boat. but for every boat caught in that storm. While the disciples, it seems that their concern was only for their lives, Mark quietly reveals that Jesus has a concern with everybody who's in the storm. Mark describes this as not just a storm, but a great storm. It's too big for these expert sailors, these disciples, to handle. And so what do? Well, they do the right thing and they go to Jesus. That's the right thing to do. But they go with a terrible attitude. Jesus wakes up with a hurtful accusation. Teacher, don't you even care that we're about to die? Teacher, do you even care that we're perishing? Think about what they're saying. Don't you care? Can you imagine the hurt in Jesus' eye? He's exhausted. He's tired. He's done all of these things for all these people. He's brought the disciples to be a part of this ministry with him. Imagine just his eyes. Have you ever said something hurtful to somebody? And you just see it in their eyes. I can't even imagine. And there's no record of an apology in this. There's no record of them saying thank you when Jesus saves them. I can imagine Jesus as he's processing what the disciples just said. I imagine him thinking, what do you mean, do I care? How can you doubt that I care? The whole reason that I came is because I care. Out of everybody, the tens of thousands of people that have sit and heard my teaching and have witnessed my miracles, out of the thousands, I've chosen you because I care. And yes, I care about everyone, but how can you ask if I care about you? You're my guys. You're my crew. I handpicked you. You're mine. How can you doubt whether or not I care? But again, we read through this and we can relate to that. God, do you care? I'm in the storm, and I keep reading the Bible, and nothing jumps out at me. There's no answers. I can't find any help. I pray to God, and I'm listening, and there's no response. And when we're in the storms of life, we conclude that God must not care. God must not care. And the truth is that Jesus cares very much. But, and I'm just being honest here, there's a truth here, and it's not about Jesus, it's about me. And I'm not proud of it, but, and maybe you can relate, but I don't like the idea of a sleeping Jesus. That bothers me, especially when I'm in trouble. I don't like that. And I can understand why the disciples asked if Jesus even cared. Because I've asked him that. I've been in a storm where I said, God, don't you even care? My thoughts when I'm in my storm may have been what the disciples were thinking, and maybe I'm reading into this too much, but I don't think so. Because if Jesus cared, well, they shouldn't have been in that storm to begin with because they were being obedient. If Jesus cared, the storm shouldn't have been so bad that they couldn't handle it because they're being obedient. And if Jesus cared, Jesus should have come to them instead of waiting for them to come to him because they were being obedient. In their minds, they're doing everything right. And this isn't fair. This isn't the way that it's supposed to work. And when it looks like Jesus doesn't care, it just multiplies our fear. And we're even more afraid, even though we have Jesus right beside of us. We're more afraid because it looks like he doesn't care. You and me and the disciples, we aren't the first group of believers to wonder this. In Psalms chapter 44, verses 23 and 24, we see the psalmist asking the same thing. He says, "Awake! Why are you sleeping, O Lord? Rouse yourself. Don't reject us forever. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and our oppression?" I think that there's a lot of people who feel like God is sleeping on the job. They feel like he's hiding his face. Or they begin to ask, has he forgotten about me? And this is a common and it is a natural response. But this doesn't excuse it. And Jesus, he teaches this lesson without really even saying any words about it, which again is a sign of a great listener, which has been Jesus' theme through the whole day. A great listener hears the lesson even when God may not address it directly. That's when you know you're in tune with God. Sometimes when we are in our storm, we don't even pull out our Bible. We don't look up the promises of God. We're not looking at things. We're not trying to read about God's promises or reassure us of His word. Instead, we think like the disciples. We may say things like, God, I know you're with me, but I don't know that you care about me. And honestly, God, I feel underappreciated. I feel used. Is this the thanks that I get for being obedient? Is this what life is going to be like with me following you? After all I've done and all I've sacrificed for you, God, it's not fair. I'm doing the best I can to listen to and to follow through with what you say. The disciples' fear of what was happening to them in the storm came between them and Jesus. They began to question His care for them. You know, the problem in this passage is not the storm. The storm revealed the problem. The storm isn't the problem. It caused them to forget what Jesus said. He says, let us go over to the other side. Even after a full day of hearing Jesus talk about the importance of listening and how their ability to listen is going to impact them spiritually, this lesson is immediately tested on that same day in their life. And they failed. And they doubt Jesus' love for them. They don't even remember His words to them. And if we're honest, I think we can relate to that. Because it's hard to read the Bible and think about it positively when everything in my life is going wrong, when everything's falling apart. And so the disciples, when they approach Jesus, which is the right thing to do, they approach Him in a very hurtful and accusatory fashion. And even though it's the right thing to do is to ask God for help, they came to Him with the wrong attitude. Now the disciples, they knew Jesus' power. They've seen it over and over and over. And so their question, do you care, doesn't address His power. It questions His character. Do you even care? And Jesus, He doesn't deal with his hurt right away. First, He deals with the issue. He doesn't deal with their attitude. He deals with the storm before He deals with His own hurt. And He just says, peace be still. Verse 39, the wind and the waves, they stopped. They didn't die down. Jesus didn't speak, and eventually it lessened, and then it quieted down and stopped. It says, the Bible says, Mark says his favorite word, immediately. Immediately there was great calm. Not just calm, great calm. As terrible and as frightful as the storm was, it was just as peaceful on the other side. It was a complete opposite. Great calm. And what really stands out here isn't just that the winds died down, because winds, we've been in places where winds just stop. We're like, oh, that was weird. It was windy and it just stopped. But have you ever been in a situation where the waves just stopped? You ever been in a pool where somebody jumps in, or you go around and you spin around real fast? Eventually, the waves will stop. But this says immediately the waves stopped. The description is a great calm. The waves didn't just stop, but they did at the command of Jesus. Have you ever wondered why Jesus spoke to the storm? Does wind and waves have ears? Do they have the capability to hear? I don't think the words were meant for nature. So if the words weren't meant for nature, who do you think the words were meant for? The disciples. When they heard this, it connects Jesus' command with His word, His power, and His authority. And now, the situation, since Jesus has woken up and Jesus has spoken, is immediately under control. And this is when Jesus turns and He deals with the accusations that they give towards Him. He says, why are you so afraid? How is it that you still have no faith? You see, One of the things I think we can get confused on is it wasn't their fear of the storm that Jesus says that's the reason why you have no faith. It wasn't their fear in the storm. A small boat in a big storm is a very scary place to be. And being afraid isn't necessarily wrong in and of itself, but what the disciples did with their fear, that's where Jesus is addressing. The problem wasn't fear. It's what they did with their fear that bothered Jesus. At first, they trusted in themselves, and they did everything they could to try to get their desired result, keeping the boat afloat, trying to get us to the other side alive. And when they couldn't do it on their own terms, what did they do? Well, they lashed out at Jesus. Have you ever done that? They question his care. They question his character. They forget Jesus' words. And they thought they were going under, even though Jesus says we're going over to the other side. Even though they just sat through a whole day of preaching of how important it is to hear and listen and apply and to be a good listener, they really didn't hear what Jesus told them. Jesus didn't say, I'm wiped out, I'm tired, we're going to set sail, and you know what? We'll just try to get to the other side, but not everybody's going to make it. That is what he said. He says, we're going over to the other side. Us, you and me, together, all of us. And the disciples could have chosen to listen to that statement, but it was really just that. It was a statement. They didn't hear the promise in it. And in that sense, they had no faith. Because it takes a lot of faith to trust in a sleeping Jesus. It takes a great faith to trust in a God who seems disconnected from my storm. And we can relate to that. But this kind of trust, that's what God is trying to build into them. That is what he's trying to build into us. And out of everybody who was there on that night, the disciples should have had faith, right? I think that's what Jesus is saying. Out of everybody. How can you still have no faith? Remember in Mark chapter 4, verse 11, previously, that same day, he tells the disciples, the secrets of the kingdom of God have been given to you. You are on the inside. And the storm, it reveals that the faith that the disciples thought they had in Jesus was really just a superficial faith. It wasn't as deep as what they thought that it was. The storm reveals what they really think of Jesus.